I'm Richard, your host. I'm from the UK, where we've got our own phase out, but that's fortunately being met by new nuclear power plants. Today, you're going to hear about phase outs in other countries. So, if you could all just introduce yourselves, where you're from, and give a bit of background about the nuclear phase out in your country.
I'm Emerick Massot from Belgium. You might have seen me in one of the panels 2 days ago. I'm an aerospace engineer. I work in the railways, and I'm also an activist to keep our nuclear plants open. So what's a bit the history of Belgium, where we were one of the pioneering countries in Western Europe to develop nuclear energy. We're one of the founding nations of the MOX fuel, which is the recycling or what we call reprocessing of spent fuel to be able to reuse in existing nuclear reactors. However, in the early 2000s, for, let's say, political reasons, the forming government wanted to ally with the Greens in order to form their government. And one of their conditions was to introduce a nuclear phase-out law. This was enshrined into law in 2003 as a nuclear phase-out law, so not as an energy transition law, with the end goal to phase out nuclear by 2025. Fast forward 20 years, we've invested massively in renewable energies. But of course, these are, for a start, intermittent, but also 20 years ago, they were not as performant as today. So what is happening now is that we still get 50% of our electricity from nuclear power, and renewables only generate about 10%, and we are still due to close everything in 2025. Our activism, and with the help of many others, which are now getting closer to that deadline, are slowly realizing it's not a great idea. We see it in Germany. Price of electricity have risen so dramatically in the last few years. And we realize that our CO2 emissions keep rising. We've already shut down 2 of the 7 nuclear power plants that we have. Our CO2 emissions have, as we predicted, risen by 13% just in the last year because of that phase out. And we also see this in our neighboring country of Germany. And so we have to really push now so that they stop this mad phase out by 2025, which is just around the corner. So yeah, this is the short introduction of what's happening in Belgium and what we're doing.
So what we've heard so far is 2 countries with green politicians deciding rightfully to build as much wind and solar as they can, but making that all negligible by taking away nuclear. And those countries haven't seen any clean electricity additions. I want to hear quickly from Emerick, who I think has a slightly different story from Belgium, where instead of replacing nuclear with clean electricity, what have they done?
So in Belgium, we've invested massively also in offshore wind. I think we have 2.5 gigawatts of installed capacity, but they produce less than 1 nuclear power plant because the wind doesn't blow all the time. So this has been installed in the last 15 years. But indeed, because our phase out is so rapid, I mean, we closed the first 2 power plants last year, and the closing due date for the rest is in 2025. There's an abrupt shutdown of 50% of our electricity. And so to be able to enable this, the government had to subsidize the construction of new gas power plants. And this was under the watch of a green energy minister. So of course, it's been a bit of a challenge. They've always managed to sell it as a transition energy. So it sounds like great. I mean, what's wrong with gas? Well, gas first emits 400 times more CO2 than nuclear energy. So we increased our emissions by 13% just by the closure of these 2 power plants. But on top of this, the problem of gas is that you have to constantly import it. You cannot store it easily, at least in great quantities. And so when you have geopolitical situation and your suppliers are not as reliable or decide to cut you off, they really hold you by your energy standards. But I mean, you really start to have a problem where you're relying on external factors to keep you on with a constant supply of energy. And the great thing about nuclear power as well is that people say you also have to import uranium, which is true, but uranium is something that you can store. France has nearly 30 years of uranium in its own hands for the next 30 years. So because the power is so dense, you can easily store it. Gas, you cannot store it very easily in large scale.
Hi, all. Thanks for being here. Fun panel. I was wondering to what you all ascribe the rationale that the Green parties and various folks who aren't yet sold on nuclear, why aren't they yet supportive? What are the various reasons for that?
I can start to answer about the Belgian situation. It's historical. The Green Party was founded upon the shutdown of nuclear energy. In the 1960s, you had the 68 uprisings and the peace and love movement, I would call it like this, which was to phase out nuclear weapons, which is something I think we should do for sure. And somehow this has mingled with nuclear energy because there's nuclear in there. But actually, if you look at the world, these are decoupled. There's more nuclear nations that have nuclear power but don't have nuclear weapons. And yet you still have a couple of countries. I think an example is North Korea, which has its nuclear weapon, but they still cannot power their own cities because they are not able to supply nuclear power. It can be decoupled for the simple reason that it depends what you invest in. It's not exactly the same technology. And the reason for the Green Party, because it's such a historical thing, it's very difficult to turn around and say, look, we were wrong about this. But I know that in the baseline of the party, the members, there is about 30 to 40% which actually support nuclear power and are very annoyed by the situation. But it's very tricky to say, well, we were wrong and we want to change this now. So yeah, that's at least for the Belgian situation.
I have a question for Emerick. There's a lot of wind in Belgium. How do the gas plants operate? Do they have to compensate for all the variation in the wind by increasing and decreasing their output continually? And does that affect the actual carbon emissions and the efficiency?
Great question. I think there's a few questions in there, but the thing is that gas plants do have to account for the ups and downs of the wind. We do have a base load in Belgium. I mean, even at night, we still have quite a strong industrial tissues.
Yep.
So the electricity consumption doesn't go to zero at night when everyone goes to sleep. Trains still drive through the night, freight trains and so on. So there is a base load need for electricity. So the subsidies for these new gas plants were for combined gas cycle gas turbines, which were always portrayed by our minister as being very efficient. They have more than 60% efficiency. But these comes with the caveat that these are actually very bad at load following. So they're very slow at load following. But the idea would be anyways, because they would replace the nuclear plants directly, that they would be there for the base load. And the current gas plants that are there for like the peaker gas plant, the most expensive one, they're still there and they're the old one. And actually, if you look back at the previous government, in the call for tender for subsidies, they were planning to add 7 to 9 gigawatts of gas capacity, but this was mostly to replace the old ones with more efficient ones and peaker ones. But because now the energy minister that actually had to execute this, well, she's a green energy minister, and it was not okay to say, well, we're going to build 9 gas power plants. So her amazing communication stunt is to say we reduced it from 7 to 9 new gas power plants, as the previous government wanted, to only 2, because now they're actually subsidizing the old one to stay alive, and they're subsidizing just the 2 new ones to replace the base load electricity. It's even crazier in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than what the previous government is, but it sounds good because they're only building 2 instead of 7.
Just one quick question finally. Is there any discussion in Belgium about looking in future towards nuclear SMRs, small modular reactors?
So indeed, in Belgium, again, the current government, because there is some disagreement within the government about the future of nuclear, the only thing that the Green Party could agree is to say we will fund now research into SMRs, because that's actually an easy thing to do. We fund research, but the law of the phase out is still there. So there's now subsidies for SMRs, and we have a very famous nuclear research center in Belgium called SCKCEN. They are now being funded to investigate on how to do SMR. It's always good to fund research, but it's a bit unfortunate that this is like some kind of throwaway money to like keep the hot potato away, whilst we are actually closing the existing working nuclear power plants. That's really the focus of my activism and our activism in Belgium, to try and overturn this phase out.
We're here to talk about fighting those nuclear phase outs. So I want to hear about sort of the advocacy that you're doing in your country and that others are doing to help stop these phase outs.
I'll try to respond to your question about activism and our fight. Just bouncing back on this, breaking the taboo, making this discussion open to be talked about. Basically, I'm one of the activists who organizes demonstrations and communication campaigns. But unfortunately, one of the things that these activist movements are usually very small. There's not that many people interested to actually do actions on the street. But what we've seen in the last few years is that it has broken the taboo. That's the nice thing, is that when I started this around 2020, we organized already what we called Stand Up for Nuclear. It was called the Nuclear Pride Festivals. It was small. Not many people were interested. The press did not talk about it, but that movement has grown. Every time we organize a new one, more people came. And eventually, when they closed the first nuclear power plant, we were there the day of the closure, and we had press coverage, national press coverage. And when they shut down the second power plant, we had more than 39 press reference articles that was stating this. And mostly in Belgium, they were either stating the facts, so just that there were some activists who were against the closure, or even positive towards our movement. So we see that breaking the taboo, being able to talk about it, is actually one of the most important things. A bit like to reflect on what Guillaume said, a lot of people, they're a bit agnostic about it, but usually it's in the same of safety. If people say, well, the real activists like the Greens, they are against it, it must be for a good reason. And I would side the side of, I don't know, so probably for being careful. If we can do it with renewables, why not? But now that we're talking about it, people are realizing, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that when there's not windy, prices go skyrocket at night, for example. In winter in Europe, when it's not windy, price skyrocket. People feel this. And now they feel that, okay, well, what is the alternative? Nuclear or gas or coal? And this breaking the taboo is what I think our fight and our activism is really helping and making the discourse being a bit more nuanced, which was before even the press was always negative, because news is usually has to be sensational. So if it's to say, well, the plants are running and it's fine, it's not news. But when there's an accident, or there was an emergency shutdown, or there was this, or there was that, there the press was always talking negatively. And now, because of our activism, I think it changes the discourse. We're talking about it because it's a thing already to talk about nuclear. And that's why I'm here at the COP, and I hope that answers most of your questions.
I think the three standout countries I know about are Japan, South Korea, and Sweden. All those three, they had lots of nuclear. They politically decided to reduce their nuclear, and now they've changed their minds again and want nuclear again. And Sweden's decided to increase their nuclear capacity by something like 4 times. And Japan wants to restart their old reactors, and South Korea is back to building reactors. Can we go through all of you guys and hear what the some messages of hope you hear from those countries and how you think that applies where you live?
What I find very sad about what they're doing is that what they've shut down is going to stay shut down, and now their plan is to re-increase with new nuclear power plant. It's a very expensive endeavor. What my hope is for my country and also for Spain is that we are able, with our activism, to prevent this shutdown and still increase our capacity. Because what they're going to do in Belgium today, what the current plan is, we're going to shut down more than 2 gigawatts of nuclear power in Doel, which is a city near Antwerp, and 20 kilometers away in the Netherlands, they are now procuring 2.5 gigawatts of new reactors for 20 billion euros. This is the current number. So that means that 20 kilometers away, we are building a $20 billion reactor to replace just what we shut down. So what we need to do is to keep what's existing. They can run another 20 to 40 years and also increase what they're doing in the Netherlands, and I hope in Belgium, maybe Spain and Germany as well in the future.
We're running to the end of our session. The session was on fighting nuclear phase-outs in the name of climate change. I want to quickly get some closing remarks. If there's any questions in the crowd, you can ask them later once we're done with this session. So final remarks. I want 5 words when you think your nuclear phase-out will be ended and sort of how positive you are about the future.
So in Belgium, we have an election in 2024 as well. All our plants are due to close in 2025. Because now it's really a topic, because we're talking about it at COP, there was a lot of media attention even about the announcement that was made here at COP. So I really do have a hope that now is the moment. Today is the renaissance for nuclear now.
Good.